Does fantasy has to be set in the medieval era? That's something I've been thinking about, and I wanted to share my thoughts with you about that. Because if we really think about it, and you might have different examples, fantasy to a large extent is put in the medieval era, and I have some books for you to show that, and also some ideas about the medieval era. Why am I curious on this? Partly because I've been listening a lot to some medieval podcasts or podcasts about the medieval era. Very interesting, I think. It's interesting because since living in Europe, the medieval era, which is usually portrayed in fantasy, or at least the fantasy we think about usually, it has the historical roots here. And it's about all the wars, all the rivalry between the monarchs, for example. You have all the class conflicts between the people living there, and you also have the perspectives on religion, for example. I have a list here with some traits of the medieval era, and first and foremost, we have feudalism. That is the decentralized structures where uh, peasants were working. They had like contract working in different areas, but they were owners, fiefdom, I think it's called in English, and they were given protection by them. But these lords who were governing the fiefs, they also had a relationship to the king, and that is, of course, something that is very obvious in many fantasy books of our time. That is very popular too. We also have the fact that the economy was very agrarian. That is something we see. Usually we follow the nobility in fantasy books, not always, as you know, and you would almost, I think if you watch the channel, know that I have a few examples here. You might guess them maybe. Um, Little urbanization. We have cities, of course. Maybe cities who had got the city name through the trade, for example, from merchants, for example, bourgeoisie, so to speak. And then you have the countryside, of course, where a lot of things is bad for people. Poor people are living there, and that's a common sight in Europe, of course, during the medieval era, that you had this kind of class differences between people, and also this kind of very unfair system, of course, that you were born into a class and you couldn't move between, you couldn't become a noble person, you were born into that. And that is, of course, something that is very common in the medieval era with the classes and the locked social structure, so to speak. And that is something we see in fantasy, where people make maybe a hero's journey and break out from that passion, for example. We also have the religion and culture. Medieval era in Europe is Christian, but we also have other faiths and ideas about tribes, paganism. We have the perception of demons and monsters living outside. Sometimes the monster is a human that we dehumanize a lot. It could be monsters that exists on the other side of the mountain where we have no idea what's behind the mountain. So we say there are monsters. Maybe so people shouldn't go, won't go there, for example. So that is something that is interesting. The uh, church and the deep religious faith, and but also the strong religious pressure on people to act accordingly to not only faith but the traditions and rules that church was and the monarch was putting out on citizens. Medieval era, as I said, you have very tough times for the ordinary people fighting for having a better life. There is a lot of diseases, for example, and there is a lot of prejudices against people as well. So I think this idea of grimdark, for example, is not so far-fetched as I sometimes tell you on the channel. I'm starting to understand grimdark more and more, I would say. But if you really look at that this time of European history, you have, of course, Game of Thrones, a very, very good example on dark times than in the United Kingdom. I think it's The War of Roses that has inspired George R. R. Martin. Would you have the obviously the portrayal of the nobility, not so flattering portrayal of the nobility, I would say, and then you have the perspective, of course, of the ordinary people, people who are soldiers, people who are peasants, people who are climbing up the ladder. It is very brutal times in Game of Thrones, as you know, and very brutal times then during the medieval era. Um, and no democracy, of course, so to speak. No human rights either. No possibility to climb on the social ladder to upwards mobility, for example. I think the maybe the medieval era from that perspective is very good to have setting for fantasy because it means you can use the fantasy, the magic, for example, to create this upward social mobility, for example, or the hero's journey, because it's you do something very impossible, possible, so to speak, in that world, in a world where the social structures are locked, for example. We also have that example, of course, in Malazan Book of the Fallen. That is a very different from Game of Thrones, of course, but still medieval era, maybe. I think it's you have that in Malazan Book of the Fallen, but you also have the big focus on the civilization versus tribes, so to speak, that conflict. So you also have not only the medieval era, but the era many thousands years back, of course, and then you have the spiritual aspect, as you know, that I usually highlight. In Malazan Book of the Fallen, I wouldn't say we have that in Game of Thrones. It seems more like a modern version of the um, medieval era, maybe medieval era, not so much fantasy. Maybe more true to the era. It seemed to be a very violent era. We have these horrible. There is a torture museum in Belgium, for example. Horrible things that happened during that era. So the human value or the individual for the single human being wasn't high back then. It seems like that's something we always have to fight for. As you know, I have currently a Witcher project, so that will be ongoing for a while, but I'm almost in the end of Baptism of Fire. I don't have the book cover here. This is Baptism of Fire. I think I do like this, and you can see maybe it's upside down. So I'm doing it like this as well. Let's see. Obviously, Witcher is in the medieval era as well, and it's taking place in Central Eastern Europe, and you have all these aspects of feudalism, the power of religion, the mysterious, the occult, I could say, magic. You have evil, you have demons, you have monsters, all these kind of things that seem to be very common during the medieval era to portray people as the other. So stigma. If you are curious on stigma, I recommend reading Irving Goffman's Stigma, by the way, book about stigma. It's a sociological book. It's very, very interesting. I think you can have a lot of use for that when you are reading fantasy, if you want to analyze fantasy. You have that a lot in the Witcher series, and in all fantasy series, you have this perspective on stigma. And I can imagine that during the medieval era, it was easy to feel, like an outsider. You are not included. There were so many barriers in the society. So it also makes up for a good setting for fantasy. Um, I'm also reading the Hussite trilogy. The first book, Tower of Fools, halfway through this book. This is it's a historical fiction, but there are fantasy elements in this. This is also the author of the Witcher books. Um, and also here, of course, very interesting to have the fantasy aspect in the medieval era, and this is about Eastern Europe, South Poland, I think Germany, and Czech Republic. And you have the same perspective that goes through all these fantasy books I showed you. I haven't showed you Lord of the Rings, maybe that is totally unnecessary, but there you have, of course, another fantasy book taking place in the medieval era. But my question was, do you need to have fantasy in the medieval era? It seems so easy, it seems so obvious, that's what everyone has done. I don't think so. I think you can put fantasy in many other eras, of course, and then you have the bridge to science fiction or sci-fi fantasy. I would like to hear your suggestions on good books that is fantasy but not in this medieval era. I'm really curious to hear your advice. You're usually giving me a lot of good advice. Also, board games have the setting of medieval era that is very, very common. I have the Mage Knight game here besides me, and great game, by the way. You have the beautiful cards like this, also medieval era cards. Um, you have things like tarot cards in fantasy as well, that is very common, and you have the soldiers, of course. Here you have one, guardsman, for example. So you have all these kind of things in fantasy. It seems like a great setting for fantasy. It seems like a great setting actually for having grim, dark stories, even though, as you know, I think it's important to have hope in what you read, and that gives you energy. Um, so that is just some random thoughts on the medieval era and fantasy. I really enjoy that era. I'm also playing Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, recommending you to check that game out if you haven't done that. A great medieval era game, no fantasy, but since there is a lot of religion and there is a lot of ideas about demons, etc., I would say there are still fantasy elements there, even if we don't really meet them, but there are in the people's minds. But maybe that is what fantasy is. We use fantasy to project our psychological fears and hopes and so on. So maybe you don't need fantasy to have fantasy. That's another perspective. So I'm curious to hear about your perspectives. You might hear that I'm a bit cold still. Uh, Very chilly days here in Sweden. Really cold, old style winter. Um, so please give me your thoughts about this. I will return with a few more videos during the week. Tell me if you're curious to if you want me to explore this medieval era perspective versus fantasy and non-medieval settings. I would be happy to do that, of course. If you're still here, there is a few things going on the channel as well. I'm going to read Shogun, the book, together with Rick, who's been a regular guest here on the channel, a friend. And we're going to read the book, and if hopefully we will talk about it on the channel. I hope we also can talk more about Pillars of Eternity, second game, Deadfire. That was a video that became quite popular for my standards, at least. And I'm reading The Claw of the Conciliator. I hope to talk about that with a contemplative reader, for example. And lastly, but most importantly, many of you wish to or requested that I will talk more about to live a calm life, to live stillness in peace. Also show you some exercises I used to do. Sometimes I do them actually before I'm reading. So that video I will release for you during this week, and that's a promise. So check that out. And for me, actually, reading is a kind of a meditative and spiritual activity in itself, especially if you do it in an immersive way. So you can read and you can breathe calmly, you can prepare your teacup, and you can just sit in stillness. You can turn on music you really like, for example, and you can just enjoy the moment in that sense. But there are also breathing techniques that you can use to prepare your reading, and I will be happy, very, very happy to teach you that. So I'm very happy to be back here on the channel, and just wanted to say hi, just wanted to check in, just wanted to give you my thoughts about the medieval era. And if you like this, please like, subscribe, you can share, you can also write in the comments below about requests on videos, and you can also write on the community page about certain requests that you have. So take care. See you soon. Bye.